guys, welcome back to today's video. And today's video, it's going to be a book review that I already reviewed and uploaded on on my channel last week, but I chose to take that down because I actually noticed there was one part of the video where I noticed there was actually the part where I played a clip when explaining mixed member proportional on the clip I showed you guys, and there was no audio in most of the clip. So I decided to take down that video and decided to record that video, in part because I that was a mistake of mine, and I want to correct that, want to make amends of my mistake, and give you guys a full finished product on this book review video. But I will be going over this book review video once again to still promote another alternative in repairing our broken democracy. So in this book review video is titled, review video that I read and reviewed this year in the spring, actually, that just came out recently. It's a new book, and it's titled Parliamentary America, the Least Radical Means of Radically Repairing Our Broken Democracy. And it's written by Maxwell L. Stern, and he's a constitutional law professor at the University of Maryland. So this goes into who the author is as a person. As I just said, he's a constitutional law professor. He teaches constitutional law and also economics law at the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law. And he's also an interdisciplinary scholar that applies the methodologies of economics as a method to study private and public law. Several of his work focuses on the current threats that our democracy faces. Some of his work also focuses on the Supreme Court, and also focuses on constitutional decision making as well. He has written largely in federalism, separation of powers, equal protections, and so forth. So that's who he is as a person, as a constitutional law professor. So he was the one that wrote this book. So in the book, there are many different themes when reading this book. The central messages of this book is learning from the experience of others. That's one of the messages that he talked about while I was reading this book, and it was learning from the experience of others. And what he means by this is getting past the idea of American exceptionalism and understanding that the institutions that we that have long worked for a quarter of a millennia or for generations that worked for that long, we need to understand that now those institutions are no longer working anymore, and it needs reform, mainly because of the constitutional crisis and how polarized we are in. So we need to first get past the idea of American exceptionalism and learning from the experience of others. Another message that he talks about in the book is the Goldilocks principle, and I'll get to this in a future. I'll get to this in another slide as I go deeper in it. So the Goldilocks principle is the idea of not having too many or too few parties, striking the right balance. And the other main message is, which is the big one, changing the mode to elect the U.S. House of Representatives, but also changing the way how the president and vice president is chosen. And also, most notably, changing how we remove a sitting president as well. So, what Maxwell Stern proposes is radical. It is radical. It's a radical departure from us voting for presidential, from us actually directly voting for our leaders and voting for the U.S. House of Representatives to elect the president and vice president. But it's least radical. It's least radical because it keeps vital political institutions intact. It keeps basic institutions intact, which makes this parliamentary system that Maxwell Stern proposes unique to American culture and to our political institutions. And also, throughout American history, we kind of were operating under a parliamentary system. You see, for one, before U.S. citizens were given the right to vote for U.S. senators, this was way before the 17th Amendment was ratified. State legislatures elected U.S. senators, and how would U.S. senators get elected under this mode where state legislatures would choose them? Well, they would have to make consent. They would have to negotiate make coalition deals with members of their state legislatures, and they would by offer where state legislatures would offer demands. Okay, we will back you for the Senate, but you have to promise us this. It would bring a sense of coalition building involved with state legislatures electing senators. So in that regard, we were operating some areas under a parliamentary system throughout U.S. history. And on top of that, the Electoral College is essentially a parliamentary system, because for one, we're not voting for a pair of presidential. We're not voting directly for the president. We are actually voting for presidential electors. And those electors are elected in November, and then in December, they meet in their respective state capitals to cast their electoral votes for their party's nominee. So in this regard, those electors are actually voting for the president on our behalf. Those are two examples of how what Maxwell Stern proposes is least radical, because not only does it keep vital political institutions intact, but the United States has also been operating in some areas under a parliamentary system, such as before the 17th Amendment was enacted, and also how the Electoral College works. We were operating in some areas under a parliamentary system of governance. And on top of that, another theme is that it invites our politicians to join us to repair our broken democracy. You see, under Maxwell Stern's proposals is that, and I'll get to them in an upcoming slide of this presentation, is that under his proposals, all 435 U.S. representatives and 100 senators, they still keep their jobs. Let me reiterate, the 435 representatives and 100 senators, they still keep their jobs. It allows to keep. What he means by this is that he wants the current incumbents who are currently in federal office, who are currently holding seats in the U.S. Congress. He wants them to be a part of the journey and adventure of us. He wants to bring them along, to join us as we repair our broken democracy. So the central messages of this book that I consider as the most important is learning from the experience of others, getting past this idea of American exceptionalism, the Goldilocks principle of not having too many or too few parties, changing the mode to elect the U.S. House of Representatives, the president and vice president, changing how to remove a sitting president as well. It's least radical when it keeps vital political institutions intact, and also how America has always been living under a parliamentary system. Think when state legislatures used to elect U.S. senators, and also think how the electoral college works on top of that. And it also invites our politicians, the current incumbents, the key political actors that you need to push for electoral reform. It brings them along. It gives them feelings that they too can also be the heroes of democracy. Those are the central messages that this book talks about. So, one of the main problems that he talks about in the beginning part of this book is the problem with partisan gerrymandering, and he talks about it in two different ways. He talks about it, one, through the lens of politicians picking their voters. This would be state legislatures manipulating district boundaries to give their side an unfair advantage. But he also talks about it through the lens of social media and how social media companies, you program these algorithms in which they can pick their users, they can pick their consumers, and when they do so, they can continue feeding information that already reaffirms that reaffirms their consumers' beliefs, that reinforces their beliefs. So adding this idea of state legislatures picking their voters and social media companies picking their consumers, that is what is polarizing our country. And that is what's growing. And that's what is growing a huge wedge between the right and the left. That is what he talked about in the beginning, partially in the beginning part of this book. The problem of partisan gerrymandering, how it's politicians picking their voters and social media companies picking their users or consumers is equaling to the ever-growing polarization and gridlock and constitutional crisis that we're in, that our country is facing, that our country is creating, which is creating a dysfunctional government. So going back to this idea of learning from the experience of others, he takes readers on a virtual world tour. So he takes you to other countries, places such as the United Kingdom, where we fought for our independence against during the American Revolutionary War. He also takes you to countries such as Germany, Israel, Brazil, Taiwan, and Venezuela. So part of this virtual world tour is getting past this idea of American exceptionalism, learning from the experience of others, and also being willing to learn how other countries' democracies operate, and seeing what features can we learn from them and take from them to implement it into our democracy to make our democracy better. So that is the big part of why he took you on this virtual world tour. But there's also another reason why. It's to also understand that the real threat to democracy is extremism. Let me reiterate. Let me say that again. The real threat to democracy is extremism. And this can happen in two different ways, in two different scenarios. It can happen whether you're dominated by two major parties, but it can also happen when you have many, many, many parties. Even when you have a multi-party democracy, so say in Europe or Israel or Germany, the extremes can still can still come to dominate under a fragmented parliamentary system. But it can also happen when you have a two-party system as well, like in the US. It's getting to this idea of going back to the Goldilocks principle, and you always want the sweet spot only around 4 to 8 parties to make it immensely difficult for extremists to take over the government. So let's first talk about how extremists can dominate in a two-party system. So in a two-party system, which would be the United States, for example, an extreme figure, all it takes in a two-party system is for an extreme figure to come in and take over one of the major parties and thus take over the entire government. This has already happened in the United States. It has happened with it's currently going. It happened in 2016 with Donald Trump. You see, the only reason why Donald Trump became the Republican nominee in the 2016 Republican presidential primary is because the Republican primary vote was completely split. It was and completely fragmented among many different candidates. And the anti-Trump candidates, being Cruz, Rubio, and Kasich, they all technically took votes away from each other, which allowed Trump to win in states, say, in states with just maybe 30% or even 40% of the popular vote. And overall, he was only able to get around 44% of the overall Republican nationwide vote. And that's how he was able to take over the Republican Party. He was able to exploit a crowded Republican Party free field. That's how extremists get into power. They're able to exploit a fragmented they were able to exploit a hyper fragmented field. And that's how Donald Trump won the Republican nomination and ultimately how he took over the government. And that is an example of how extremists can dominate in a two-party system. But that can also happen when you have But that can also happen in a multi-party democracy as well, whenever you have too many parties. Think Israel, for example. Think Brazil. And also think Germany during post-World War I. You see, and speaking of Germany has this horrific history of the Holocaust. And if you recall, during the aftermaths of World War I, Germany was in economic ruins. They were just coming out of World War I. The Allies imposed a war guilt clause on them, in which they were forced to pay for all the damages that the war caused on Europe, and that put Germany in economic ruins. They were dealing with hyperinflation. They were dealing with a lot of economic issues, and whenever those economic issues arise, populism begins to surge, and that's exactly what happened. You see, during the Weimar Republic era, the German parliament was hyper fragmentized. And because of it being super fragmentized, Hitler's Nazi party was able to go into the parliament and just get a plurality of the vote and thus get a plurality of seats. And once they did, they began rolling over other parties. And when they start rolling over other parties, you're starting to see the gradual erosion of democratic norms. And when you start, when democratic norms start eroding, that is when democracies die and go to authoritarianism. You see, democracies, we may all think that democracies die in this spectacular military fashion, but that's far from the truth. Most democracies die from the gradual erosion of democratic norms. And we're seeing that right now in the US. Look what they're doing to Donald Trump. Donald Trump has just been found guilty on 34 felony counts. I don't remember the crime he was found guilty on, but they did it in the middle of an election where he couldn't even campaign to his voters. Right there is showcasing the gradual erosion of democratic norms. And it can happen whenever you have two dominant parties. That can happen in a two-party system. But it can also happen in a multi-party system as well. Whenever your legislature is hyper-fragmentized. So the overall point that he's making here is learning from the experience of others that there are some democratic features that other countries employ that works better and can be implemented into our democracy, but also understanding that the United States does need a multi-party democracy, but we don't want too many parties. We want the sweet spot. We want the Goldilocks principle. Around 4 to 8 or 4 to 6 or 7 parties is the sweet spot. Because with 4 to 8, 4, 6 or 7 parties in the House of Representatives, you ultimately make it immensely difficult for extremists to take over the government. Because when you have around 8 parties or 6 parties or 7 parties, those parties also have competition with other parties. They're forced to form coalitions, to negotiate, make deals with each other. That's what makes it a lot harder for extremists to get into government. And that's the main point of why he takes you on a virtual world tour, learning from the experience of others, and understanding and believing in the principle of the Goldilocks idea of having 4 to 8 parties to make it institutionally harder for extremists to take over the government. And then in the book, he also talks about the third party dilemma. You see, under our current political system, our presidential system, and our winner take all, first past the post voting, plurality voting system, third parties are largely viewed as either spoilers or randomizers. Spoilers spoilers are third-party candidates who take votes away from one of the major parties. Think Ralph Nader in the 2000 election, or even think Jill Stein. Think Pat Buchanan who also ran for president as the Libertarian candidate in the 2000 election that took votes away from George W. Bush. That's a one way third parties have a powerful role of who is ultimately elected the president. One of those areas is that they are viewed as spoilers. But third parties are also viewed as a randomizer. What this means is that third-party candidates who are viewed as randomizers, think Ross Perot in 1992, they pull votes evenly from both sides. And this makes the election winner decided by a simple flip of a coin, or by a flip of a coin. It turns the election into a game of chance and gambling. It makes the election outcome uncertain. So, the overall point that Maxwell Stern arguing here is that the role that third parties have under our current system, with them largely being viewed as spoilers, taking votes away from one of the major parties, or being also viewed as randomizers, polling votes evenly from both sides, in which the election outcome becomes a sense of gambling, or in which the election results outcome becomes completely uncertain and we don't know who will win. That is the role that third parties play under our current system, under that's embedded within the structures and institutions. And what he's arguing here is that even though there is a desire by the U.S. public, I think it's 63% of the U.S. public saying that a third party is needed, that growing need and frustration will not create a thriving third party. In order to create a thriving third party, Maxwell Stern argues is that we need institutional and structural change to our government to ensure third parties have a meaningful role in helping to form the government. They need to be empowered, in which voters are rewarded and not punished for voting for a third party candidate. And so this brings me to another point that he also mentions in the beginning and the ending chapter of the book, talking about the other reforms. So he mentions reforms such as ranked choice voting, open primaries, such as top 4, final 5 voting, which I'm not a fan of. As you've seen my Twitter account, I'm not a fan of top 4 or top 5 open primaries. He also talks about other reforms such as a national popular vote, reapportioning the Senate, term limits for Congress, and so forth. He believes those popular reforms will not get us out of the constitutional crisis, nor will it build a thriving multi-party democracy. You see, when it comes to ranked choice voting and multi-member districts and top 4 or top 5 primaries, the main goal that he says that many popular reform advocates say is that their idea is that they would replace current ideologues with centrists. And the argument that Maxwell Stern is making is that with these popular reforms like term limits, ranked choice voting, multi-member districts, what you're essentially saying is you are telling current members of Congress to vote for their own unemployment. And thus, you are not getting the key political actors. On board with electoral reform, and you need their support to push through reform through the legislature to help build a thriving multi-party democracy and to get us out of the crisis that our country is in. You need those key political actors. And and that's what his proposal would end up does. Under his plan, Parliamentary America, it's radical, but it's least radical. It's designed as a that's unique to the American politics and to our culture. It changes the way we elect the U.S. House of Representatives. It also changes how the president and vice president is chosen. And it also changes how we remove a sitting president as well. So let's dive in, shall we? Oh, no. Before that, the three amendments that Maxwell Stern proposes is in one of those first amendments is that he enlarges the U.S. House of Representatives changes the way we elect U.S. representatives. The second amendment changes how the president and vice president is chosen. And the third amendment changes the way how a sitting president is removed. So let me reiterate. The three amendments that he proposes. The first amendment changes the way we elect U.S. representatives, and it also enlarges the U.S. House of Representatives. 2, it changes how the president and vice president is selected. And 3, it also changes how we remove a sitting president. So let's now begin, shall we? Under the first constitutional amendment, he enlarges the U.S. House of Representatives to 870 members. And this is the reason why he does this is because under this amendment, he adds another cohort of representatives. But they're not elected through single member districts. They're elected through a party list system. So they're elected based on the state party the state party. So a number of votes that a party gets in one state will determine how many seats they get in that state's congressional delegation. So under this amendment, he institutes a mixed member proportional system where voters would get 2 ballots, one for a candidate, one for electing a candidate to represent you in your congressional district, as what we do now. So under that plan, under this proposal, the 435 representatives currently in office, they still keep their jobs. The 100 senators, they also still keep their jobs as well. But voters also have a second ballot. They have a party in which they vote for one political party. And that will determine how many votes a party got in one state will determine how many seats they get in the state delegation. This goes back to this idea of learning from the experiences from others and going and learning what democratic and learning how other countries do democracy and seeing what systems can we implement into our that we can learn from them and bring over to our country's democracy to make our democracy more vibrant and more prosperous. And the system that he proposes is already in place in countries such as Germany and also New Zealand. Germany uses mixed member proportional to elect their lower house of parliament, also known as the Bundestag. And New Zealand also uses this system to elect their Ucramal legislature, being their House of Representatives. But to go even further, here's a video. Here's a little clip that helps you explain what mixed member proportional is.
MMP, or Mixed Member Proportional, is the system we use in Aotearoa to choose the people and parties who represent us in Parliament. Under MMP, you get 2 votes every general election. Let's have a look at how they work. Your first vote is for the political party you support. This is called the party vote. The more votes a party gets, the more seats they will have in Parliament. If 40% of us vote for the Cherry Party, it will get around 40% of all the seats in Parliament. If 10% of us vote for the Peer Party, it will get about 10% of the seats. To get any seats in Parliament, a party must win at least 5% of the party vote, or win an electorate seat. That's where your second vote comes in. Your second vote is to choose a Member of Parliament to represent the area you live in. This is your electorate vote. The candidate who gets the most votes in your electorate will become your local MP. So, if the Banana Party wins 4% of the party vote, but no electorate seats, they have no members in Parliament. But if they win 4% of the party vote, and also win an electorate seat, then they are entitled to 4% of all the seats in Parliament. This 4% would be made up of their one electorate MP, with the rest being list MPs from their party list. Because MMP is a proportional system, there can be a range of big and small parties in Parliament. Every candidate who wins an electorate gets a seat in Parliament. The remaining seats are filled from party lists according to their share of the party vote. Under MMP, parties might not have a large enough share of the votes to govern alone. So, it's common to get support from other parties to form a government. The political party or group of parties.
So, as the video explained, and as I explained earlier, under a mixed member proportional system, voters will get 2 ballots. Under this system, voters would essentially have 2 different types of representatives from the state that they reside in, where one of those representatives would represent a local constituency, and whoever gets the most votes wins. Same system as we already do under our current system, which allows the current 435 representatives to still keep their jobs. But it would add another cohort of representatives elected through a party list system. So you would have half of the members of the U.S. House of Representatives, which would be 435. Those 435 are elected from single-member districts. And the other half of 435 are elected based on a party list proportional voting system. So under this area, this allows voters to this empowers voters, and it also empowers third parties. And here's why. You see, under this system, voters, in your first ballot, when you vote for just one candidate to represent you in your congressional district, under first past the post, you still have to vote strategically under your first ballot, in which you'll probably either vote for the 2 major party candidates, which would be either the Democrats or the Republicans. But in your party proportional ballot, which would be your second ballot, where you vote for a political party, you don't have to vote strategically because it's a proportional voting system. It compensates for the district seats. So even if a party is still underrepresented, if a party is still underrepresented in one state, they will still be given those extra party list seats to compensate for that disproportionality, to ensure that state delegation is good enough proportionality. Not perfect proportionality, but just good enough proportionality in which voters feel like they have elected the state delegation that they wanted to send to Congress. So under the first ballot, as I said earlier, you are essentially forced to vote strategically, in which the race is essentially between the 2 major party candidates. So you would if you're a Democratic voter, you would most likely vote for the Democratic Party candidate in your first ballot, and if you're a Republican voter, you would most likely vote for one of the Republican candidates in your first ballot. But in the second ballot, you can then vote for another political party to signal to the major parties that you want them to go in this direction. So if you're a progressive voter, in your first ballot, you would vote for the Democratic Party candidate, but in your second party ballot, you want the Democrats to move in a more progressive direction by implementing things such as Medicare for all, free college tuitions, student loan forgiveness, or cracking down on climate change, reducing fossil fuel emissions, which is all important. You may also push for other demands like gun control regulations. What you're essentially signaling is what this First Amendment does, and what the Second Amendment will do, which I will explain later, is that you're starting to empower third parties. And what this First Amendment does, you're empowering voters to signal that you want the major parties to go in this direction, that you want the government, what do you want the government to focus more on? What you want the government to prioritize or more on? If it's whether crime or focusing on the economy or immigration. You would essentially be empowered by those party proportional ballots to tell to one of those major parties that you want them to move into either a left-wing direction or a right-wing direction. Or if you're a Republican, or if you like the Republican Party on some issues like fiscal conservatism, but you don't want them to partner with the Make America Great Again wing or America First, you want them to partner with centrist Democrats, then you may vote for the Republican Party on your first Republican candidate that's running in your congressional district on your first ballot, and then you would either vote for the Democratic Party in your second ballot, which would indicate that you want a more centrist coalition. You want Republicans and Democrats to work together. Or if you want the Republican Party to go more in a conservative direction, you would vote for a Republican candidate in your first ballot to represent you in your congressional district, and then you vote for either the Make America Great Again Party in your second proportional ballot, or another conservative, a bit more of a conservative party, indicating that you want the government and you want the Republican Party to go more in a conservative direction. This First Amendment is all designed to empower voters, but it also gets the key political actors involved, because it allows current members of Congress to still keep their jobs, but it also gives them additional powers as well. You see, under this First Amendment, the U.S. Senate is given the power to lower and also increase the initial 5% threshold by a simple majority. So you would need 51. The U.S. Senate would need the Senate Majority Leader would need around 51 votes to increase or lower the initial 5% threshold. And they can lower it from 4 to 3 to 2 or 1%. But they can also increase the threshold from 6, 7, 8, and 9, or even 10%. And 10% is the limit. They can't raise it above 10%. They can only raise it. The maximum limit where they can raise a threshold to is 10%. And this creates a sweet spot with this electoral threshold. What he argues, again, as I say again, you want the Goldilocks principle. And with electoral thresholds, it prevents the legislature from becoming too fragmented, but it also prevents the legislature from being dominated by two dominant parties, in which with around 4 to 8 4 to 6 or 7 parties, you make it immensely harder for extremists to take over the government. And this is exactly what the first constitutional amendment does. It institutes a mixed member proportional system. That's the big pitch. So now let's go into the second constitutional amendment. And this changes how we choose the president and vice president of the United States. So under this plan, the Senate majority and minority leaders, after an election of the U.S., after voters voted for members of Congress, they will certify seat totals of all qualifying parties in the House of Representatives. The seat totals that each party got will affect the ordering of party negotiations. So how this is designed is, so the party who got the most votes in an election in the House of Representatives and thus got a plurality of seats in the House of Representatives will first be given the opportunity to negotiate, and it will be first given the opportunity to negotiate. But if they at the end of the election, if they already won an outright majority in the election and don't have to form a coalition and just govern alone, which can still happen under parliamentary systems and under proportional representation, but it's very rare. But if they do, they can automatically vote for their presidential and vice presidential candidates if they already have more than half the seats necessary to elect their presidential and vice presidential candidates, the next president and vice president of the United States. But if they only have a plurality of the votes, so less than half of the seats in the House of Representatives, they will first be given the opportunity to negotiate. And if they fail, then it's given to the second largest party, and then the third, then the fourth, and then the fifth. Under his plan, through coalition negotiations, he allows up to 5 party leaders to negotiate a majority coalition. And this right, and before I go even further, under this plan, there's also a fallback provision in case as a last resort. If there's no coalition, if a coalition negotiating, if there is no majority coalition that forms, the party with a plurality of seats would then elect their president and vice presidential candidates as a last resort, if no one is able to form a majority coalition. The biggest thing here is, yes, we may lose the right to vote for the president and vice president. We never really voted directly for the president or vice president. We voted for presidential electors in the Electoral College currently under our current system. But under Maxwell Stern's second constitutional amendment proposal is that you are empowering third parties. You are allowing third parties to get into you're allowing third parties to have you are rewarding voters who vote for third parties, because even if a third party got around 15 or 5% or 10% or 20% of the popular vote, and they don't get, even if they don't get the most votes, they are still rewarded because they still have seats in the House of Representatives, in which they can make demands saying to either the Democratic or Republican Party, hey, we will help you elect your presidential and vice presidential candidates, but we want you to promise us cabinet positions in your administration. We want you to appoint certain people in your administration. We want you to lead in this direction. We want you to promise us policy concessions. We want you or offering we want you to offer we want you to offer us the first Supreme Court seat that opens up, or another court seat on either the circuit court on the circuit court seat that opens up. We want you to offer us a judicial nominee that we can come to accept as our court to fight for our values and for our interests. And what you're doing here is you are building a political system in which you're empowering people who support other parties, such as the Libertarians, the Greens, the Reforms, Constitution Party, and so forth. You are rewarding third parties who are campaigning, in which they are no longer viewed as a negative vote. They're viewed as a positive vote, in which they ultimately will play a massive role in helping to form, will ultimately play a massive role in coalition negotiations, in negotiating a majority coalition. And that is how you will build a multi-party democracy, by giving third parties an institutional role in helping to elect the president and vice president of the United States. So that's what the second constitutional amendment does. But there's one thing else that I want to also acknowledge what this amendment also does. So under this second amendment, is that parties will still possess the right to associate, which means they are free to choose how they produce their slates for the office of president and vice president however they please. So they can choose whatever primary structure they want to elect their president and vice president. They also have the right to associate of how they choose their Senate candidates, and also how they choose their House, the people who run in the 435 congressional districts. And they also are free to choose the ordering of each of the party list representatives get off the list in any of the states, based on any of the states' proportionality vote. And they also possess the right to facilitate House coalition negotiations as well. So what this does is it empowers current members of Congress. It gives members of Congress, it gives them additional powers, and it also gives the political parties additional powers as a way to get the major parties on board. And what you're doing here is you're getting the key political actors involved in joining us to repair our broken democracy. And that is what you need to push for electoral reform to build a multi-party democracy. You need the current political actors, which is whether it is Hakeem Jeffries, whether it is Mike Johnson, whether it is Mitch McConnell, whether it is Chuck Schumer. You need those people. You want to empower them and give them additional powers. So, because politics, as Maxwell Stern stated in the book, is all about power. Everyone is competing. Every politician is competing for power. And you want to make sure there is that balance in which can make not everyone happy, but what can make the current key political actors happy to build a thriving multi-party democracy. So then that's what that is what the second constitutional amendment does. and how it changes how we choose the president and vice president. So the third and final constitutional amendment. Alderaan seconds the motion of a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum. Happy belated Star Wars Day. If you remember that movie scene from Star Wars Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, in which Queen Amidala said that she put forward a vote, that she encouraged the Senate to move for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum. That is exactly what the third constitutional amendment does. It's what Maxwell Stern proposes. Under this third constitutional amendment, this changes the way we remove a sitting president, in which it's no longer done by the impeachment process. It's by a 60% vote of no confidence by the House of Representatives to remove a sitting president based on a finding of maladministration. So 60%. So if we take Maxwell Stern's first two amendments, where the First Amendment doubles the size of the lower house to 870 members. So 60% would be 520. You would essentially need 522 out of 870 members to remove a sitting president from office based on a finding of maladministration. And you all may be asking me, what the heck do you mean by the term maladministration? Well, my friends, Maxwell Stern defines this procedure very well on page 306, in which he quotes, maladministration may include mismanagement of federal resources such as financial or physical resources, offices or perks for purely personal or partisan advantage, systematic ineffectiveness in working with cabinet members or other elected officials, state and federal, systematic embarrassment on behalf of the nation in conducting international affairs, a documented pattern of conveying misinformation to the public or in official communications, and other behaviors that produce widening distrust in the president's ability or willingness to govern effectively or to effectuate the office's constitutional responsibilities. This listing is not intended to be exhaustive. A no confidence motion need not allege criminal conduct, and violations of a federal or state criminal law do not necessarily demonstrate maladministration. So what this essentially means is that he is changing the way we remove a sitting president. So instead of calling for an impeachment based on the fact that, instead of calling for a long impeachment process in which we have never removed a sitting president through U.S. history because of the high bar that's needed for Senate conviction, what he is saying is that you can now remove a sitting president based on political matters, based on politics, if there is growing disappointment, or if there's growing distrust by U.S. representatives in the president's ability to govern and to effectuate his constitutional responsibilities, then he can be removed by a 60% vote of no confidence. So he does. The House can put forward this motion in this way. So in order to call for this motion, you would at least need 15% of full House membership, and with at least 5% of the full House membership as part of the original governing coalition that elected the president. So to say that again, you would need 15% of full House membership, and with at least 5% of the full House membership as part of the original governing coalition that elected a president. So, and with a 60% vote, with 522 members needed to remove a sitting president. This means you would, and on top of that, neither sponsors of the motion and even the vote, and if you vote on a motion, it has to be made in the public. It cannot be made in secret. He ensures that the sponsors who sponsor this motion and when the representatives do vote on them, and when they do vote on the motion of a vote of no confidence, it has to be made in public. And that's what this third constitutional amendment does. So, the overall theme is that, these three amendments that Maxwell Stern proposes is that Max Stern proposes is that he believes it would get us out of this constitutional crisis, because for one, it allows current members of Congress they still keep their jobs. So the 435 representatives that represent the 435 single member districts, even if it's representatives you dislike, they still keep their jobs. It still keeps the 100 senators, even people who you don't like, it still keeps their jobs. But it also adds another cohort of representatives, party list representatives, where it empowers voters who vote for a third party to tell to the major parties that I want you to move in this direction. I want you to move a bit more left. I want the government to be a bit more left wing, or I want the government to be more right wing. That is what Maxwell Stern proposes, and why he believes that would get us out of the constitutional crisis, and what will build a thriving multi-party democracy. On top of that, and as I said earlier, but I didn't go too deeply into it, is that it keeps a lot of the political institutions intact. He keeps the 2-term limit intact. He keeps the U.S. representatives at 2-year terms. He also keeps the Senate at 6-year terms. He keeps the succession. He keeps the presidential succession line intact. Based on a vote of no confidence, instead of the House, instead of like usual parliamentary system where they call for where they call for an early election where voters have to vote again for the parties. So instead of calling for an early election or the House taking at least 6 or 5 weeks to vote for a speaker, to elect the Speaker of the House, like as we saw after Kevin McCarthy was ousted as Speaker, instead of going through that circus, which is fine which is okay, as long as politicians are negotiating and making deals, and finding the best one to lead our nation. Under the voted Third Amendment, as I explained in the previous slide, when a sitting president is removed, the vice president takes over. It keeps the presidential succession line in place. So after the president is removed from office, the vice president assumes that role. So in this way, he designs this parliamentary system that's unique to American culture, and it's unique to our political institutions, where it doesn't change too much of our political system. It changes the way how the president and vice president is chosen. It changes the way how a president's removed, It also changes the way we elect the U.S. representatives, but it's least radical in terms of is that when it keeps the 2-term limit for the president. And ultimately, he believes that these amendments are necessary to repair our broken democracy, and it also gives third parties a meaningful role in forming the government. And then in the ending part of the book, Maxwell Stern talks about what the world will look like when we're in parliamentary America, where the aftermath of when we did, if we did successfully pass these 3 constitutional amendments that he proposes, what the world would look like, in which we can have other conversations on other things, such as gun control, such as healthcare, infrastructure, or reapportioning the Senate. And speaking of the Senate, he also talks about in that chapter what the world will look like in parliamentary America, talking about that over time, if we do pass these 3 constitutional amendments that he proposes, he talks about that over time, the Senate will become a multi-party institution. And then we can have other conversations like reapportioning the Senate, or even reducing their power to a more of a policy advice, to a more of a advice and consent type of role, in which the House of Representatives would reign supreme over key policy making decisions, such as over key policy making decisions. And on top of that, and on top of that, and he also argues that we can also increase the term lengths of representatives to 4-year terms, and the Senate to 8-year terms, in which we realign the representatives' terms, in which they're aligned with the president and vice president, to ensure that every 4 years representatives would be up for re-election, which would therefore affect who sits in the Oval Office. So the overall idea is that these 3 amendments that Maxwell Stern proposes are necessary to get us out of the constitutional crisis and to build a thriving multi-party democracy. So overall, my overall opinion is that I support these 3 amendments because I also believe it will help reimagine American politics into a thriving multi-party democracy, mainly because, in part, is that it gives current members of Congress additional powers, and it also allows current members of Congress, people like AOC, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Mike Johnson, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, it allows them to still keep their jobs. So you get those key political actors on board to support such a proposal, but you're also empowering newer parties and voters who are now rewarded to vote for a third party every time they go to vote for the U.S. House of Representatives. Sorry about that, guys. My screen recorder cut out, and I stopped recording it when I wasn't ready to finish speaking yet. But as I said before, under his 3 amendments is that I believe that this will help reimagine American democracy because it gives current members of Congress additional power, and it also allows them to still keep their jobs. It invites them on this journey to repair our broken democracy, and that's why I support it. Because any reform, whether it's electoral reform or criminal justice reform, you're going to need the current incumbents you're going to need the current incumbent politicians to get behind any reform proposals that you advocate for. And that is exactly what Maxwell Stern argues for. He argues that's why he advocates for these 3 amendments, because it allows them to still keep their jobs and brings them along and lets them also be the heroes of democracy. And it fits with my theme as well, because we can all be agents of change that can truly reimagine America and all of our states for generations to come. But overall, and on top of that, I also support I have over time from supporting the current electoral college, from supporting a proportional allocation of electoral votes, and also supporting the national popular vote for only a short period. I have grown more and more supportive of the House of Representatives electing the executive branch. I ultimately do support a parliamentary system, mainly because, for one, it enhances executive accountability. It increases the flexibility of the lower house legislature, which usually happens under parliamentary systems, to remove a head of government, mainly because a person such as a prime minister, being from Canada or even Norway, or the federal chancellor, say Germany, they have to still maintain the confidence of the majority of the lower house to still govern the nation. Number two, it doesn't marginalize losing parties that came in second or third, because those parties that came in second or third in any of those states, in any region, they will still have seats in the lower house, in the lower house of the legislature, in which they would either maybe be a part of the majority government, or they could be part of the official opposition focused on holding the government to account. So think about it this way. Imagine at the end of the 2016 presidential election, where Hillary Clinton and her Democratic Party got a plurality of the vote, and Donald Trump, Make America Great Again, received, maybe fourth place or third place of the vote. Instead of marginalizing losing parties, what you're doing now is you're empowering third parties to play an incremental role in ultimately electing the president and vice president of the United States, mainly because after the election is held and after all the citizens voted, the U.S. representatives and the party leaders would conduct coalition negotiations up to 5 parties each, and they would negotiate a majority coalition by making amends and offering concessions with the major parties to build an everlasting majority coalition. And even if your party doesn't end up in the government, your party still becomes the official opposition. Can you imagine some of the debates under a parliamentary system if the U.S. was one, where at the end of the 2016 election, Donald Trump became president, but Hillary Clinton was still on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives and holding Donald Trump's administration accountable and holding his government to account by saying, "Hey, why are you going to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act? Why are you going to lower taxes on the super wealthy? Why, when we should be lowering taxes for the middle class to strengthen the middle class in our economy?" Those things like that, those debates is why I believe a parliamentary system is superior, because it doesn't marginalize losing parties. It doesn't marginalize parties that came in second or third or fourth in an election. It empowers them. It allows them to make demands to the two biggest parties, and to say, hey, we will partner with you in helping to form the government, but we're going to demand some things in which we want you to fulfill on. Say, policy accommodations, such as policy proposals, cabinet appointments. We want you to appoint this guy as Attorney General. We want you to give us the first Supreme Court seat that opens up on the U.S. Supreme Court. Those coalitions is what doesn't marginalize losing parties, and it what also enhances executive accountability as well. And lastly, we need to bring back a sense of coalition governance through negotiating and making deals. I think we have lost the sense of the Democrats and Republicans wanting to work with each other anymore. They have no incentive to. They're more incentive on winning the next election and gaining power whenever they lose power. Gaining power when one major party gains power. The goal for the other major party is to make the other major party look bad so their party can gain power. And in which none of the issues that we care about get solved. It remains unsolved. And that is something we need to change. And that is why I support a parliamentary system. Because for one, it enhances executive accountability. Number two, it doesn't marginalize losing parties that came in second or third. And it brings back a sense of coalition governance through negotiating and making deals. And that is why I support a parliamentary system, and why I support Maxwell Stern's 3 constitutional amendments. But overall, if we want to make parliamentary systems a reality, start advocating and lobbying for these systems as a way to choose your state executives, in which the state legislature is elected through any system of proportional representation, in which they are empowered to vote for your governors and other statewide executive officers. Because the more experiments with parliamentary systems that we can do in other states, the more popular that it may get, in which it can present itself as a second alternative to repair our broken democracy, which I believe is a better alternative than a national popular vote. But overall, you guys, I highly suggest you guys pick up Maxwell Stern's book, Parliamentary America, The Least Radical Means of Radically Repairing Our Broken Democracy. Mainly because I highly suggest you read this book, because in my opinion, it gives you another viewpoint and another fresh alternative of how we can get out of this constitutional crisis, of how we can reduce the polarization, and how we can ultimately build a thriving multi-party democracy. But overall, you guys, thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment down below. And until next time, guys, this is the Young Centrist, and I am out.